Hello viewers, welcome to MOOC's online course on Visual Perception and Art, a survey across the cultures. This is lecture number 9 and today we will be looking at primitive art as a case study for visual perception. Now by primitive art we generally mean the artworks which consist mostly of masks and heads and faces of human beings and other birds and animals, or a composite of different elements, and also certain kinds of ritualistic figures and sculptural objects. And the most famous primitive cultures, as far as their art products are concerned, are of course the African primitive art, the Iberian primitive art, then Polynesian primitive art, so on and so forth. Now the moment you look at any primitive art, particularly the masks which represent the heads of either real people or imaginary people or ancestors or spirits, these heads and masks do not usually correspond to any kind of naturalistic representation. They do have signs like holes where the eyes should be, and then you make out, okay, this is a pair of eyes, little raised vertical strip running right through the middle of the face, and you realize, okay, that could be the nose, or a slight slit underneath the nose, and you realize, you can figure out, okay, that's the mouth, things like that. But any random example of primitive art generally suggests that the artists here are not at all concerned with the normative visual perception, because what you find in these African masks and Iberian sculptures or Iberian masks is that every kind of element, whether it is the pair of eyes or the nose or the mouth or the ears or even the very shape of the head and the face, they are all very exaggerated. You can even use the term distortion. In many cases these masks look pretty distorted, but considering the fact that many of these objects are actually meant as they were meant to be used as masks, so probably it makes sense that when somebody wears this piece as a mask on his head, then perhaps along with the body, the real body of the human being who is using this mask assumes slightly a different dimension. Nevertheless, when you look at these masks independently, without even thinking of its original context, then the visual perception that is apparently employed here look very much out of this world because of its exaggerations, because of the look, because of the appearance, and very importantly, most of these primitive masks have very weird shapes. The shapes of our faces and heads, in spite of ethnic varieties and all, they do have some kind of common features that they share among themselves. But in African masks, it seems that every shape is slightly different from the other. If this one has a very squarish face, the earlier one was quite oval, and the one preceding that was not only oval but at the same time it has a very strong curvature, things like that. And then when you get used to this weird shapes and exaggerations, and when you have already begun responding to the expressions on these heads and faces, you find that even the expressions are also pretty non-natural and weird. Interestingly, if you run through even 15 to 20 random examples of African art, or any kind of primitive art for that matter, you will notice not only a variety of shapes of heads and masks, but also particularly there is a whole lot of variety in which the eyes have been executed. In most cases, because they are masks, the eyes do have holes through which the real person behind the mask can actually see through these holes what's happening around him. But when you look at these eyes from outside on the mask, you have very, very strange appearances. Not only because their shapes differ, but also because their looks differ. They look different, and because you are looking at this mask, you are looking at the eyes, and you are trying to establish a kind of eye contact with the masks. It is at this point that you feel something strange about the way they are looking back at you. Then not only with the shape of the head or the face and the eyes, similar kind of exaggeration, or let us say distortion, or let us say unusual kind of formations are also found with the rest of the body, with the limbs, with the legs, and the positioning of the limbs, and the juxtaposition of the arms and the legs and the limbs. They are weirdly strange, not only because they do not represent the body at all in any naturalistic sense, but they actually get rid of that sense of body, and they use these arms and legs only as a pattern or a geometric structure. Then in many cases you realize it is not only the pair of eyes, but it is also the mouth that creates huge expression on these masks. Going back to our main concern, that is visual perception, we may ask that what kind of visual perception is involved in making these eyes and mouths so weird and different between one and another. Now, there is no straightforward reply to this query, but this is true that each and every mask has a very distinctive expression, and this distinctive expression is coming from the different adjustments and relationships between the eyes and the nose and the mouth. So it is a visual perception that is arising not exactly out of a direct visual experience, but out of, once again to use that same word, out of creativity and imagination. So these African and other primitive artists, they are wonderfully gifted and talented artists who do have the power to create an imagination, create and imagine over and above any kind of visual perception. In fact, if we are to characterize the visual perceptions of these artists who are making these masks and heads, we must look at their artworks in order to figure out their visual perception. Because it is these masks and heads that their visual perception is embodied in. So how do you explain all these so-called distortions, exaggerations, and unnatural elements and forms in the context of visual perception? One particular method of explaining it or preparing yourself for a certain explanation is to make yourself familiar with the different kinds of primitive masks, be it African or Polynesian or Iberian, whatever. It is because, you see, we might make a wrong assumption. We are subject to make mistakes while studying and looking at these visual perception and these masks, because also we are not very familiar with it. So it is not about just quickly glancing through one or two examples. We need to look at least 20, 30, 40, 50 different kinds of marks very intently, and before even you make any sense out of them, at least you make yourself familiar with these masks, visually familiar. And it is this visual familiarity that is so comforting that in the next moment you will be able to almost figure out the visual logic that is involved in, for example, in this mask, why these eyes and mouth and this nose is protruding. As far as the nose is concerned, we are not bothered because nose always is protruding, even in real life. Even our mouth is slightly protruding. But what about eyes? Eyes don't protrude or project itself out from the skin the way they are in this mask. Now, it's very difficult to explain, but one thing is sure, that we will be ending up with some wrong assumptions if we are constantly thinking about some representational clues. For example, when you look at this pair of eyes over here, which are protruding very strongly out of their eyes, and if we still tend to consider them as only eyes, probably that is not going to get us anywhere. I mean, if we are to ask that why they have represented eyes with this kind of protrusion, why it is so three-dimensional, then probably the answer that would come from them is this, that well, my dear friend, we are not simply representing the eye. More than eye, we are trying to express the look or the gaze. So this three-dimensional existence of so-called eyes is actually an expression of the way these masks are supposed to look at you or stare at you. In fact, it was a part of their norm, particularly in the African communities and other primitive indigenous communities, that their masks should not have a deadpan look, should not. Their masks should have a look that will always make us feel that these masks are continuously staring at you. This is very important. These masks should keep looking at you, keep staring at you. It is this sense of gaze, this sense of staring that these primitive artists are continuously trying to express. And in many cases, perhaps this protrusion of eyes, this the fact that these eyes are jutting out from their socket, helps the artists to express what they want to convey, that is the staring. So, if we do not know this particular context, this conceptual context, that these masks are supposed to stare at you continuously, because these masks are representations of, also in many cases, representations of your ancestors. Ancestors in spirit are there in these masks. So when these masks are put up on the walls, and when these masks are continuously staring at you, it suggests that your ancestors are also keeping an eye on you. They are taking care of you. They are protecting you. In other words, these masks are very protective masks. They are supposed to ward off the evil that might inflict some damage on you. So in an African primitive mask like this, the formal elements and their shapes never match the real visual shapes, yet they are expressive enough. So the visual perception over here has deliberately utilized these principles of exaggeration, distortion, protrusion, not with any objective or idea of distorting the real, but rather to capture and captivate that is beyond the immediate tangible world, because in reality their ancestral spirits are not always around, but they are there in their mind, they are there in their culture. So how do you represent them? So right at the conceptual level, there is already a shift from the tangible reality, and obviously the visual perception also follows suit and takes a shift and moves on to venture into the intangible reality. So some of these masks might have a slight naturalistic touch also, like this one. They follow the shapes as in real life to some extent, yet it is the conception and the idea behind these masks that rule the visual perception. So even in those examples where the masks do have a naturalistic touch, where the masks do reveal a naturalistic approach on part of the artists, even there, because of a very strong conceptual foundation on which these masks actually exist. So these masks could never become a full-fledged naturalistic representation of a face. But these slight touches of naturalism on these masks do reveal that these artists were actually able to render naturalistically. But the usual perception is on our part that an artist, whether he is a primitive artist or prehistoric artist or a folk artist, goes for distortion and exaggeration because he or she cannot handle naturalism or realistic style. Contrary to the idea, we have several such examples where African and other artists from different primitive and indigenous communities are actually able to render things, objects, figures, human beings very naturalistic. But they resist, because too much of realism and naturalism can make their artworks very, very close to the real and far away from that intangible world. For example, this one. This is a fairly realistic portraiture. It's a very realistic head. So when you look at this, then it becomes virtually impossible to say that these primitive artists did not know how to follow a realistic method or a technique of representation. They did know. This is one proof. There are many such evidences. But usually they would not go beyond that, because like in real life, in their art life, in their cultural life, in their conceptual life also, these indigenous people consider the intangible life as real as the tangible life. But in a much more urbanized and sophisticated environment, our visual perception always teaches us to address visual perception as a tool to understand the tangible world. Hence, our visual perception usually conforms to certain normative principles. But in a life like this, among the indigenous communities, when the intangible world is as important as the tangible world, the visual perception or the principles of visual perception based on which you build up your art cannot only follow a particular normative structure, because in this case they need to address the intangible, the spiritual world as well. And how do you do that? You need to have a different set of visual principles then, and that is what exactly they are exploring in their artworks. Next one. So here also again you see a slightly different combination and juxtaposition of the nose, of the nose, the pair of eyes and the eyebrow and the mouth. And at this juncture, I would also like to suggest that apart from this desire to address both the tangible and the intangible world in their artworks, in these primitive masks, you may also begin to notice certain ethnic features. I mean, these masks actually have a very close resemblance with the people who would use these masks. So in that sense, the visual perception involved in making these masks are pretty real, because these masks, I mean the visual features, the facial structure, the character, the facial features, the eyes, they correspond pretty well with the real human beings of the real communities. So hence the whole idea gets now very complicated, at least very complex, that on the one hand you have this tangible world, on the other hand you have this intangible world of the spirits or the ancestral world, because the ancestral worship or the ancestral cult was very, very important and significant for these indigenous communities to survive. It was a part of their belief system. So one had to also address them, but at the same time it's very important that you do not make your masks so weird and so strange that your own people do not recognize. In order to ensure certain kind of recognition, they also make the masks come very close to, in look, in appearance, their own people who would use them. Not that this happens very deliberately, but it does happen, and perhaps it happens very spontaneously. Then it is not just the face, as I have already told you, the entire body may also be based upon a different understanding of the anatomy in the visual expression. This one as well, or this one. You may look at the mask or the face separately, but then you look at the entire body. So obviously there is a certain kind of disproportion that you notice, but then we need to forget these words, get out of these terms like disproportion and distortion, and begin to look at it as a very, very positive form, which is empowered to embody some very strong concepts that govern these entire communities for ages. So what looks like a distortion or disproportion in our normative eyes, which is trained in a certain kind of visual perception, may be very powerful for those people, these indigenous people, who expect these figures to embody and hold some strong spiritual connections. Whatever it is, this belief system is very important, because that guides and shapes the visual perception of certain communities. Now the visual conception of some of these ritual masks strongly suggest an affinity with bird or animal, and hence the shapes of these faces too share the characteristic features of birds and animals. So what might look very strange and weird at the beginning may begin to look quite okay with us, just because of this fact that many of these masks are not purely human either, or purely animal or bird either, because these are mixed kind of masks. These are composite masks where you find features of both human beings and creatures from the animal or the bird world. For example, this one also. So the strangeness that we are talking about, the strange appearance of these masks, is not just strange per se. It is a result of certain combination of different kinds of creatures, human beings with birds, human beings with animals, or bird with animals. Now to combine these two or three different entities within one body or within one facial structure is not so easy. But whatever is the result, it makes the result very, very fascinating visually, and also very unreal in the sense that they don't represent the human figure straight away anymore. Or this one. In certain figures which are called fetish figures, you find a lot of other elements like nails which have been put all over the body, things like that. Now, these figures embody not only the visual character and visual features, but also a belief system. So obviously the visual perception that we are talking about in the context of the primitive art has a lot to do, a lot to share with the belief system, with certain superstitions maybe, with some religious systems, with some religious customs, and that alters, changes, shapes your visual perception. So what looks like a weird body full of nails is actually a fetish figure, and where some kind of belief system has been enacted upon already. At the end, quickly we shall also be, we should mention this fact that how the visual perception that is evident in the primitive art has left a great impact on the development of modern art. Many of the great modern artists like Pablo Picasso, Modigliani, or within India we can also talk about our Rabindranath Tagore. You find them, these artists and many others were greatly influenced by the possibilities of utilizing this unique visual perception that you find in African, Iberian and other primitive masks and figurines. So the technical and stylistic freedom enjoyed by the great modern artists like Picasso or Modigliani or Rabindranath Tagore, to name a few, owes a lot to the styles and expressions in primitive art. You can see the detail of a face from a painting by Picasso 1907, and this face has a very, very strong, profound, obvious kind of similarity with many African or Iberian masks. So Picasso, beside others, was one artist who was consciously borrowing this possibility of a different kind of visual perception that he found and discovered in African or Iberian or other primitive masks, and he was trying to employ these elements in his own artwork. Now this one is a painting by Rabindranath Tagore, and here too you see that the idea, the visual idea of this figure, the construction of this figure is definitely a result of Tagore's familiarity with primitive art that he must have seen when he was traveling abroad, or for that matter this one. This is a sculpture which is generally known as a cubist or a post-cubist sculpture by Picasso, but it is very difficult to deny that however however authentic this sculpture is in terms of Picasso's own imagination and creativity, the fact that Picasso was able to arrive at this kind of reconstruction of faces in a peculiar way is due to his huge interest in primitive art. In other words, primitive art actually did a great service, knowingly or unknowingly, to the development of modern art. So, Picasso's Cubist formation and reformation and Cubist breakups have really got a lot to do with the primitive art. So, primitive art's visual perception became a kind of a great fascination for many of these modern artists, and particularly when you look at this whole painting called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, the famous and the first Cubist painting painted by Pablo Picasso in 1907, and when you look at the entire painting, you find that the distortions on some of these faces are clear indications of a very specific kind of visual perception evident in primitive masks. In some figures in this painting, you can see the style is evidently Picasso's own style. In some of the figures, particularly the two female figures on the right hand side of the painting, you don't have to look at their body, the body could be still very much like the way Picasso used to or was painting, but look at the faces. Not only it's not only that the faces are not naturalistic, but the faces look like masks because Picasso is directly using the visual perception that he noticed in primitive masks. So, at the end, we can say, to summarize today's lecture, that on the one hand, primitive art was able to kind of explore, knowingly or unknowingly, some unique possibilities of visual perception informed by their culture, belief system, etc. And on the other hand, when the so-called modern people started studying primitive art, they got highly influenced by certain linguistic possibilities of primitive art. In other words, visual perception in these examples like primitive art and folk art, they actually visual perception was able to endow this art with new linguistic possibilities, that is, new kinds of visual languages or modes of communication. Thank you.